epic Annette was inspired by and based on the real and extraordinary life of Anne Beaumanoir, who you met when she was nearly 100 years old. You met her at a film festival in the south of France. You describe your meeting as a coup de foudre, kind of love at first sight. And when you met her, you observed at that time that you didn't plan on necessarily writing about her life and her story, and yet you end up writing about it. So my first question, I have kind of three questions. Tell us about this amazing woman and her life. Tell us why, after thinking that you weren't going to write about her, did you end up writing about her? And why, when you did write about her, did you write about her in this form, the form of the epic?
So that's already three questions in one. So I don't know
we
if
don't have much time.
So I start by telling you about this woman and about she was 94 when I met her, and she was just standing up after the event. I was sitting here like we are sitting now, and I just had discussed a documentary film about Nazism and then the following generations with these two other people, and afterwards she I as you sometimes do when you're a writer and you're invited to this kind of event and you say, yes, I'll come, you may say some stupid things, I guess. I mean, you're not only you're not always you don't have any expertise on things, or you're just there because you wrote some books and so and then there was this very small and very frail old woman standing up and telling us that she had been herself in the resistance, and besides other things, and I was struck already by the fact that I had been talking so much about these things, and then there was this woman sitting there, and I felt a little bit stupid, because I mean, it would have been much more interesting to have her sitting there, and then I managed to talk to her later on, and she stayed for the dinner. Actually, she took me to the dinner with her car at 94. And then she told me a little bit more about her story, which was she was born in 1923 in Brittany, in a Catholic family, not a Catholic family, an atheist family, but in a Catholic area of France. And in the as a very young girl, she entered the resistance, and she went first to Rennes, then to Paris, and to Lyon and Marseille. And in Paris, she saved the life of two Jewish children, teenagers, and of a baby too, actually, so three. And very quite a long time later, in 96, she was made righteous among the nations for that save. So, and then after the war, she became a doctor, she became a neurologist, and then she married, she had children, and then the Algerian independence war broke out, and she got engaged again in the kind of resistance this time against French state. And so she was arrested in 59. She was sentenced to 10 years prison. She managed to escape in a very adventurous way. So that was more or less, and yeah, her life, her political life. I mean, that went on after she was fighting against Macron in her last last years of her life. But
so at what point did you decide to write this story?
And then I just wanted, at the beginning, I just wanted to know her better and to see her again, because I really liked her and I was fond of her as a person too. And interested also in her story, of course. Then I returned to Dieu-le-Fille in the south of France, where she lived, and I got to know her better, and then at some point I wrote her memoirs, and it was really fascinating to read this book, published at a very small publishing house in France and in French, and but I thought it's a little bit, it's too bad that, I mean, she has all these qualities I don't have, but she's really not a writer, and so nobody would read this book because it's not very well written and it's not very well edited, and that was the moment where I started thinking of dedicating her a book.
And why in this form, the form of an epic? Because in the book, you mention kind of several times Odysseus, and you liken Annette to Odysseus, possibly in part. I mean, you talk about him being a nobody, which of course in the Odyssey he's referred to as a nobody, as a way to hide. You liken her to Odysseus for her constant movement, which we'll talk about in a little bit, her kind of shape shifting. But of course, she's not Odysseus, and this isn't ancient Greece. So why choose this form? And did you find it challenging to translate a kind of more modern contemporary story into a kind of old, antiquated form and language style?
Yes, I found it definitely challenging, but it was a question at the very origin of the book, the very beginning of the book. The question I asked myself was, how could I tell about a person who really lives, who's not a fictional character, but who is sitting here in front of me and trusts me, and I couldn't imagine making out of this a traditional, more conventional kind of novel, like an historical novel, because then I would have had to invent details and write dialogues and put in her mouth words she never said. And why should I have done that? I mean, it seemed stupid to me to do it in this traditional or conventional way, because this life was already an adventures enough without me inventing details. I mean, but then but I thought, if I stick to the facts or to what I could know about her life, I'm not a biographer either. I'm not. I don't work with the methods of a biographer. I don't tend to be to exhaustivity, neither to objectivity. It's more the contrary. On the contrary, the literature is more about subjectivity, I think. So, and how could I do it? It was really difficult, and I was thinking about it, and then suddenly I remembered that there was actually a very ancient literary form in which the great deeds of heroes, not here heroines until now, were told, or better, were sung about. And because that's all about rhythm and about not to fictionalize the story, but to put it in a certain rhythm that would push me. No, it would carry me and would maybe carry the reader too. And then what I liked about it was, of course, also the contrast between this very old, frail woman and the very masculine and warrior-like genre of the epic. And it was also then about not writing in this very elevated tone of the ancient epic, but to put into the book some of the way of talking of Annette, who was a person who was speaking in this very quick and vivid and colloquial way, and so that formed a kind of contrast to the too to the ancient genre of the epic.
This is great, in large part because it sets up many questions that I have for Tess, which is that not only was this, a challenge for Anne, but also for you as a translator, and you point this out in your translator's note at the end, that it's precisely the kind of manipulation of these different registers. So we have the lofty of the epic form, we have the more colloquial of Anne speaking, we have the kind of sardonic and funny interludes. So there's that challenge, and then there's also the challenge, as Anne's just pointed out, of the rhythm. Can you talk to us about how you negotiated these two challenges as you translated it?
Well, there was, well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming to celebrate this wonderful book. There's actually a third challenge as well, which is that Anne wrote it in German, and then she wrote it in French. And she wrote it in French before the German appeared, based on the same material, but even if you write down your memories, they change. If you try to write something twice, it's never quite the same, but it probably changed her understanding of the material, of the characters, and so forth. So with these sardonic asides that come in throughout the book, they're different in French and German. The humor is different in French and German. The rhythms, the respective rhythms of the languages are different as well. So in the one sense, it was overwhelming and intimidating. On the other hand, it was liberating, because it gave me a bit more distance to find an alternative. If she can take liberties with her work, then I don't have to worry about. I mean, I was very responsible, but I could choose whether I wanted to respond to the French or to the German. And then I had to find a rhythm that worked in English and that was consistent, that had echoes both of the German and of the French, maybe depending on where the action was set or who the main actors were. So that it was a challenge to do. I tried different methods, which I learned today that Anne also had. I tried doing it in iambic pentameter. I tried a strict blank verse. I tried just prose with no line breaks, and somehow the material seemed dead. So then I returned to just this rhythmic organization that Anne has very subtly woven through the book, that the tension and the quickness of the rhythm, or I would say the regularity of the rhythm, changes a bit according to the tension of the sentence itself, of the story that's being told. So it's immensely variable. If you wanted to sit down and scan it, you couldn't do it. If you try to pin down why something works, it's hard to put it in words. It's more a sort of an instinctive, very subjective solution. The way I hear it in English is probably different from anyone else who would want to reproduce it, which is, I would celebrate another English version of it. I'd be very interested to hear how that person hears the rhythm of the story and of Anne's voice.
Well, we're going to talk about the particular discrepancies, moments of discrepancy between the English and the French and the German. But before we do that, I am curious if you could just talk briefly about your process. So did you read the French version first? Did you read the German version? Did you have both versions side by side? When you reached a moment of kind of translator crisis, did you go to the French, German, or did you call up Anne? I mean, this is a triangulating translation constantly.
Yeah, it was very much a triangulation. I read it initially in German when Susie, the publisher, asked if I would be interested in doing a sample, but she also made clear that she wanted a translator. Maybe, I don't remember if it was wanted or preferred, encouraged her said translator to work from both versions. So I would read one passage in German, I'd read it in French, I'd decide which one I thought worked better, and I would take that. That's a little flippant. I would, try. I think I leaned more heavily on the German one because that is kind of the official one. But if as soon as there were departures in the French, I was careful to compare the two, and it was nice because I did have these two alternatives. That's what I mean, but it was a bit liberating for me if the German word order, if the aside, or maybe even just the rhythm worked better, then I could use it as an inspiration rather than as a chain, as a limitation.
Right, and given that Anne herself was French, do you feel like you know her best in the French version?
Well, she's German actually, but
Right.
she's lived here for 40 years.
No, Anne.
Oh, Anne Beaumanoir.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, right. Oh, so sorry, there are too many Annes.
I know.
I completely picture her as French, and so the passages where you're kind of in Anne Beaumanoir's mind, to me, sound more French than German. But I'm no longer objective because I've read it so much between the two versions. And then there's an overarching voice of the narrator, and that voice is very different in the two versions. So it's complicated. I find that voice a bit wryer, a bit more, a bit lighter, a bit less. Not that the voice isn't serious, but it's just a bit freer than the overarching voice in the German.
Okay, back to the story. We're basically moving between story and translation. So you describe having met Anne. She's 94, and yet she has this, as you say, this real kind of force. And actually your description of your meeting at the end of the book is so moving because, as you pointed out, it's this, you're kind of in the situation where everyone's talking, and all of a sudden one person talks, and it makes everyone else realize, as you say, how much kind of busy talk there's been, and then finally someone who has something they really need to say. And that really comes across, I think, in the book, and which is to say the kind of strength of this woman's force, of her spirit. So I wanted to read a few of your sentences to kind of make sense of this, and then also ask you a question. So early on, you quote Anne, who says, "If you don't have any strong convictions at 16, in brackets, in Annette's words, then there's a good chance you never will, in non-Annette's words." This is again, I think, kind of paraphrasing. "We hope for the best and go full speed ahead towards a place that doesn't exist and never will, a place where peace, freedom, and fraternity don't rule so much as prevail." I found reading this that there was this really strong kind of through line through Anne's life, which is this kind of constant movement towards this unreachable ideal, dream. You describe it as a longed for future land. And of this longed for future land, you write, this is kind of you imagining Anne talking to the land. "Do you exist?" she asked. "Here, I'm here," a small voice answers faithfully, like an eternal flame, flickering unseen in the distance. And then you write so movingly, "We take one small but momentous step after another because we cannot stand still and we must keep moving." So I hope you can understand the kind of imagery I'm trying to set up here, which is there's this kind of, this flame, I think, that you noticed that Anne saw in the distance that's guiding her throughout her whole life. And she's always moving towards it. It doesn't really exist. Tell us about this constant movement of her just taking one small step after another towards this ideal.
That's a very good question, actually. Thank you. I didn't learn any Greek in school, but I think utopia means no place. So it is a place that doesn't exist. She's moving towards to, and it's an idea, and it's probably and it was when I met her, it was so amazing to see, and she was 94, and I knew her until she was 98. She died at the beginning of this year at 98, and there was still, until her until her very last weeks, the very last weeks of her life, this strength that this movement and this desire of some for a better world, and I, not that I don't have any wishes about a better society and better world, but I just couldn't. I was amazed about this determination throughout a whole life, and so maybe it was also one of the reasons why I wrote the book. It was because I thought I could maybe learn something about her motivation, and probably there's not just one motivation. That's at the end what I thought, because, for example, in the resistance, she told me that she was very young, 19, 20, and for her, as for other young people in her age, there must have been also a desire of, I mean, of course, it was the idealism and to fight the German invader and oppressor but there was also a desire, that's what she told me, a desire of adventure, and of these young people just like to do things they were not allowed to do before. For example, lying and hiding and to live in a false identity, and they took pleasure in doing these things as a child would do, more or less. So that's could be one motivation. I mean, very soon there were limits of this desire, because very soon they realized that what they risked, and they risked not only death but torture. But also there is one episode in the book that is not immediately connected to the story of Annette, but I put it in the book because it's very important to me, and when I think about it, it's about the assassination of the Tsar Alexander II in 1881, and to be sure to kill him, to hit the Tsar, several terrorists or revolutionaries came to a special place where he and the first one threw his bomb. He didn't hit him. The second one hit him, and the Tsar actually was dying. He was lying on the floor, and he was very briefly injured. He was injured, and so the third one, who didn't have the opportunity to throw his own bomb, in a kind of human reflex, would rush to the dying Tsar to assist him. And I still find this episode so really amazing, and beautiful, because it shows, I mean, it's just on this question, what is the motivation of someone who fights through his whole life for a better world? And is it in the book? There is a passage where I say, is it love that makes the revolutionary? Is it hate? And I mean, is it the love for the oppressed, for the one who suffers, or is it the hate of the oppressor and of the tyrant? And in this very special scene, it seems to be these two things at the time. And that is, I mean, when I think about it, I will always remind some images I saw about, for example, Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi. And when these people, these tyrants, are at the end of their life, like hunted animals, and injured and tortured maybe, and they are going to die, they actually become visible again for us as human beings, and you can pity them, and you can, again, and so it can be, and it probably is both of these, love and hatred at the same time.
Yeah, I was rereading it this afternoon, and that passage caught me in a way that it didn't catch me the first time. The dual motivations. We're going to you, back to you. This is fairly, well, I suppose thinking about the kind of dual motivations and thinking again about the French and the German, since you sent me a very interesting PowerPoint presentation in which you have kind of excerpts of different passages that you were working between, and to kind of highlight moments of, let's say, extreme tension between the three texts. Can you just share one or two with us that kind of synthesize the challenge?
So there were different 3 or 4 different kinds of discrepancies that I had to resolve between the 2 languages, and probably the most fun was humor, because Anne would make puns and use wordplay in the text in the German, but then it didn't work in the French, and so she'd find another one, and then I would have to figure out, either do I take, do I work with the German, do I work with the French, do I find one altogether? For example, there's one passage where, just after the socialists have instituted paid holidays for the workers, they're coming to Brittany, and the locals see these people as Parisins. They just see them as coming from Paris, even though they're coming from all over. And the thing is, Pariser in German means condom. And so the narrator—
We have some Germans in the audience.
The narrator says, no, not what you think. They're actually Parisians rather than just the Pariser. But in the French, this didn't work. So she moved the puns to, well, for the locals, these people all came from the capital, so they were as good as capitalists. So she just took moved the gravity, sort of the balance of weight to the capitalist, then from the Pariser. And then of course I took the capitalist pun, because it would have taken all the humor out of explaining what Pariser was. And then, and then sometimes, when I was mentioning earlier about on rewriting it for the second time and getting more distance, and maybe seeing which themes were more important or seeing them differently, you have a few more lines in the German than you do in the French. And I was talking about this afternoon, and someone in the audience got very upset with Anne that she would, add, like, how can this happen? And Anne said,
to your own work. How dare you edit your own work?
And I was trying to explain, she didn't translate it, she rewrote it. I'll just give a little translation of the German. And so for the context, Annette is 19 or 20. She's working in the resistance, where there's a double blind for all your contacts. So you only know 2 or 3 people in the resistance, and you only know them under an alias, so that if you're tortured, you can't give anyone up. And Roland is her first and probably last great love. And so they've been moved to Lyon. And so the narrator says, their only contact in Lyon is this so-and-so who probably doesn't even exist. And yet Roland knows someone Roland does know someone in Clermont-Ferrand from the resistance. That's a bad translation, but I was trying to be literal. And so in French, I'll just read it in French because I'm sure most of you will understand. Leur seul contact lyonnais était celui qui finalement n'est pas venu, mais Roland se souvient qu'il connaît aussi quelqu'un à Clermont, quelqu'un de la résistance s'entend. Et c'est le genre de petite pensée de rien du tout qui peut changer le cours d'une vie, c'est bien connu, mais pourtant on oublie et grâce à cet oubli, on vit. So you have this emphasis, this additional emphasis on how, you know, a chance occurrence or a fleeting thought can completely change the course of your life and maybe lead to, you know, to a death, which it did in Roland's case, or spoiler alert, or to, you know, to a whole new promising chapter. And so, of course, in the English, I added those 4 lines, concentrated a bit. And then, of course, because German is an inflected language, you can deliver the information in a sentence or in a passage differently. There's a bit more sort of internal drama to sentences in German than there can be in English. So it was slightly more straightforward in different passages, not so much in this one because it's so short. But then the English version ended up as their only contact in Lyon is this so-and-so, who probably doesn't even exist. But Roland remembers someone he knows in Clermont-Ferrand, someone from the resistance, of course. Such fleeting thoughts can change an entire life. We all know this, but we usually forget, and by forgetting, survive. So it's, I guess, listening again or reading it again out loud, the rhythm in English that I hear is probably closer to the French, even though I stuck more closely in the initial process to the German. So that's one example that I hope you can hear of how the two versions are different, and then the English is somewhere in between.
And Tess will be around after the event for a little bit if you have other kind of specific questions, because it is endlessly fascinating, and I'm sure you could point to many other moments in the book.
Or if you have problems with the extra lines, you can talk to Anne.
Or you can talk to me and I will decide whether or not to pass them on to Anne.
The next step for Tess would be to give her 3 versions of a book, and then she would translate from the 3. But
I could add 4 more lines in English.
It occurs to me, so in the interest of time, moving towards the kind of end of Anne's life in the book, you're working, so just as kind of Tess is working through 3 languages, you're working from, as you mentioned, her memoir published in 2000. You're also working from oral accounts of her life, conversations you had with her. And yet a kind of another really reoccurring idea that I found myself returning to again and again as I read this is this idea that, and you write about it a lot, is that those who kind of live in the present, in media res, are, and I'm quoting you here, shrouded in fog, buried in sand, walking in the dark. There's this real sense of when you're in the mix of something, you have really no idea of what's going on. So for much of her life, maybe Anne felt that she was constantly moving, yes, but with no real sense of where it was headed, and always feeling kind of buried in the sand. We have a Beckett in the audience, so buried in the sand is maybe a shout out to Beckett. At what point do you think that Anne was able to conceive of her life as a whole coherent tale? At what point was she able to have that perspective to finally look back and see it in all of its shape? And for you, as a kind of student of her life, do you feel that there are still kind of gaps and inconsistencies that you weren't able to resolve, even in something as coherent as the form of a book?
well, there are actually a lot of gaps, and because I was not working as a conventional novelist, filling up these gaps, because that's what fiction is about. It's more filling up lacks, I guess. But I think I just think about when she was she was working for the Algerian government and the health ministry. I think she was blinding a lot of things out about the FLN, the movement for the Algerian independence, and their methods and because, for example, she got committed to this movement because when she heard that the French army tortured their Algerian prisoners in Algeria, and so she thought that these people were working with the methods of the Gestapo, of people who she just fought against in the Second World War, and so she couldn't stand it, but now she learned after she was arrested and escaped to Tunisia and to Algeria, that the Algerian army tortured their prisoners too, and they also tortured Algerians and killed a lot of Algerians because they were from another sort of independence movement, and so then in 65 the independence was in 62, so she stayed in Algeria for 3 years, and in 65 there was a coup, and then she had to hide again, and then to try to get out of the country, and she had to leave the country. But in these weeks where she was hiding in a place, a friend's place, she was thinking a lot about what she did and about Algeria, and I think there was already a kind of looking back, a kind of disillusion, and things were becoming clearer to her. Also, what she had lost, what she had sacrificed, because she had lost her 3 children, 1 newborn she had to leave behind when she escaped, and so of course it's getting lighter in a way when time passes. Things get lighter, but also probably you could also say the opposite, because I mean, you have a lot of memories, and most of them would evade. I don't know, would s'évader, evaporate, or fade away, and so it works. The metaphor works in both ways.
It's so interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way, which is to say that maybe to be totally active and to have that kind of movement, one has to be shrouded in fog, because if you weren't shrouded in fog, all of the complexities of all of the different causes and all of the interconnection would be too overwhelming, and you would have to stop. So to move is to kind of stay in the tunnel.
Yes, maybe the fog is the condition for someone to act, to do things, because if you already could see clearly what's all about, probably you wouldn't, or yeah, I don't know, you wouldn't do anything, or you would do something else.
Very interesting. Okay, we wanted to move to new territory for the final question. So Tess pointed out to me that she'll be translating Cécile Weisbrot, is that how you pronounce it? Weisbrot, Nevermore next year. So this is the story, I haven't read it in full disclosure. The story follows a translator who herself is translating a section of Wolf's To the Lighthouse. Anne recently translated this book into German. You will translate the book into English. So this is kind of meta translation on so many levels. We have the author, her translator, having just translated a book that you will then translate about a translator.
And Cécile wanted to come tonight, but she's out of town.
I'm so glad you didn't, because I think the 21st century kind of postmodern would have imploded. How does Weisbrot's understanding of translation in the book help you understand the challenge of translating?
Not at all. In fact, the opposite. I may have been, I think, foolish to take this book on. I have different ways of rationalizing it to myself, but one of the problems is, I mean, the book is many things. It's a reflection on translation. It's a reflection on the passage of time, on destruction, the aftermath of destruction. And so all these are interwoven metaphorically at different levels. But on a practical level, Cécile quotes a line or two from Virginia Woolf's English, and then she thinks about you sort of see the translator's mind at work. She gives different variations of, of the words, of the sentences, and it goes through it. I mean, one example is the title itself, To the Lighthouse. What do you do with that in French? Is it vers le phare? Is it au phare? Is it voyage au phare? Is it, there, she goes, and so I can't change Virginia Woolf's English, so to speak, but I can translate the character's thoughts on translation and the meanings the way propositions don't map in the different languages, which Anne had to do in German. So at one remove, it was a little bit easier, I think, maybe, or maybe not. It was just different to bring the German in. So the way I rationalize it to myself, that not only will the reader get it, but it will get something interesting out of it, is that by having Woolf's original sentence and then variations on Woolf's sentences, different words, or maybe the word order or the emphasis in the sentence put in different places, it becomes, for me anyway, a really subtle and incisive meditation on Woolf's style, because her style is very accessible, at least in the Lighthouse. It gets, different books are, there are various levels of accessibility, but she'll throw in an idiosyncratic word, or she'll use a word idiosyncratically. Not, it doesn't stop the reader, it doesn't even slow them down, but you can overlook it if you read it too quickly. And so all of a sudden, if you're forced to read her sentences really and focus on each particular word and the order of the words, it opens up her style in a way that I certainly had never seen before. So this is the hope. We'll see what happens.
I would like to ask you about your translation too, and your bridging German and French constantly. This is a lovely quote that Tess sent me. You wrote in Two Souls of this kind of unstable place. The place where I stand is unstable. It is an in-between, and this intermediacy suits me. Standing between two languages, between two stools, between two literatures, between two histories, I'm conscious of not entirely belonging to one or the other of these worlds, of not feeling at home anywhere. This is the place from which writing is possible for me. Can you tell us about this in-between place?
Well, I guess as I've been living in France and Paris for such a long time now, nearly 40 years, I really tried for several reasons to not to get rid of my German mother tongue, but to learn French well enough. And I did actually to write and to speak quite more or less perfectly French. But then I realized at one point that I couldn't go further, and then I stay German, and it's I don't know if you realize so well if you're an American, for example, but it's not so much fun to be a German. I mean, it's abroad, you're always associated with Nazism, and you're supposed to be not funny, very serious person, and actually quite boring person. And so you don't like to be so much German, and I don't. So I try to become a kind of more French, and but still I had to admit that but there is a kind of in between, but there are these deep roots. I don't have the same relationship at all to the French and to the German language. I feel really in German that the words don't have all the same weight. They are really much more heavy, and they are weighting me down sometimes. And so these deep roots to a language for a writer might be a kind of a hindrance, because that's probably why I tried this kind of diversion via French, because I feel much more free and much lighter in French. So that's my in between.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anne. Thank you,
Thank you.
Tess. Give me a big round of applause, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So now I think we have about, this clock is wrong, I think, right? It says we hit 20. We have about 10-15 minutes for questions. So are there any in-person questions? Miss Emily Biggs will bring you the microphone. Any questions?
So just to add in the context of what you've just described, which is fascinating about the two languages, what made you write the German version first and then the French of this particular work?
Actually, when I started writing, I wrote in German because I was living in French. It was my only language. Then when I came to Paris, I wrote German too for a while, and then I started writing French, and my very first novels or books were written and published and the first one was published in France for before the German version. And maybe three books later, I changed and I suddenly started writing German first. And I tried to explain it to myself afterwards, because of this kind of diversion I probably needed via a foreign language to get kind of a distance to myself and to the language. But I don't know exactly why but now I do it this way, and I probably will go on. But, yeah.
Any more questions?
Yes, and for both of you, in researching this, and Annette, a beautiful person, what is the qualities of her that you want the reader to feel, and for future generations that read your book? And in doing the translation, will you let her answer first? Did you get the same feeling about her, the type of person she is, that the outstanding qualities of her?
A few qualities she had, and it's probably a very strong sense of justice and injustice, and a kind of determination, and of she was really an action how do you say, a person of action. And also what I really liked about her was that she was behaving the same way with everybody. She wasn't treating someone with more respect because he was probably not big. She wouldn't have had treated the queen in another way, and then she would have treated some street worker. I don't know. For her, really, all human beings were equal. I mean, we probably think in this way, all of us, but do we always behave in this way? I mean, most of the people I know, and including myself, probably wouldn't. If I'm really honest with myself, I don't think so. So for example, that's if there was someone lying in the street, on the street, she would go and ask him what his problem was, and what she could do about it, this kind of thing.
And it comes through very, very strongly in the book, this instinctive sense of justice and her refusal to look away. When she rescues the three children, it's explicitly against the resistance rules. You're not supposed to take personal initiatives. And she also went, at 19, not really knowing what she was going to do with these children who were young teenagers. I mean, she just assumed her parents would take them in, and if her parents wouldn't take them in, then she would find another solution. And then you see this again later in her life with Algeria. She decides, I mean, she has a medical career, she has children, she has a husband, but she decides that this is an injustice and someone has to do something. And what can she do? She'll be a porteur de valise. And so she does that. And it's not that she didn't know the risks, but I just don't think that they entered in the calculation for her. And so that comes through very nicely in the book.
We have a question on Zoom that we'll turn to really quickly from our lovely Zoom audience. Joanna Fisher has asked, how is she remembered in France? And are the French people cognizant of her courage, moral and in action, and her profound sense of hope for, as you state, a better world?
I don't think she's so well known in France. For example, a few years ago, there were the remains of two resistance fighters, female resistance fighters, were brought to the Pantheon, but Annette would never be in this case because of her engagement during the Algerian independence war, and these people are still considered as terrorists nowadays, and so I think she got a little bit. There was a documentary film a few years ago, in France 3, a regional program in France, but and then now there's my book. But she's not. That's also a reason probably why I wrote the book, because I wouldn't have written it about a person who already got all sort of honors, of official honors. That it seemed to me kind of recompensation.
Any more questions in the room? Yes, look over here.
Question for Tess. As I'm a translator as well, although I'm not doing literary work. So I'm actually quite fascinated with the idea of working from both the French and the German. Because in my own work, I find sometimes if there's too much information, you can really get quite overwhelmed and you lose all sense of where your text is going or what the style or tone or voice actually is. But it seems to me that either working from the French or German, which seems using both, seems to me like a momentous task. Do you find it more enriching than an overload to have the second text to go to?
I thought it was a luxury because, and sometimes when I've done a book that's been, say I'm doing a book from German and it has been translated into French, I may consult it to see how they solve the problem. I try not to read too much of it because I don't want that to sort of take over, and become my solution necessarily, but I will look if it's available and necessary. The problem is that translating from the two languages, which actually wasn't so much an issue here, I think it's because Anne works between the two languages herself, is that translation isn't just about the language, it's about all the allusions, at least literary translation. So it's the allusions, the implicit quotations, all the cultural history and baggage that goes with it. And you have to be attuned to that as well. And so my French is actually better than my German, but because I've done more German books and I know German literature a bit better, it's actually easier for me to translate from German. So I kind of feel caught. They end up taking both an immense amount of time, but for different reasons. Yeah, so it's an impossible question. And then of course, each book is its own labyrinth.